Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on biochar and carbon dioxide removal presented by the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy at American University. My name is Jason Funk, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm working with the Institute and with American University as a fellow. However, most of my time is spent running something I call the Land Use and Climate Knowledge Initiative, which I founded in 2019 with the aim of promoting more informed, cooperative, and charitable solutions at the intersection of land use and climate change. My task today is to help all of you become more informed about the important topic of biochar, and I plan to do that simply by staying out of the way as much as possible because we have an excellent lineup of speakers today. First, let me just give a few housekeeping notes. All of you tuning in are muted, and you'll be muted for the duration of the webinar, and your video will be turned off as well. So in order to allow us to interact, we encourage you to write any questions you have into the Q&A tab, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen for the Q&A portion of the webinar. You can also feel free to use your chat box to submit comments or maybe any technical issues you might have along the way. A recording of this webinar will be available on the Institute's website shortly afterward, along with many past webinars on relevant topics concerning carbon removal. You'll be able to access these webinars at carbonremoval.info. Carbon removal is all one word with no punctuation or hyphens. And be on the lookout for our next webinar on December 2nd about enhanced ocean weathering and carbon removal. Today's 1-hour webinar will explore biochar as a carbon removal method. We'll start with 3 presentations from our panelists, then we'll open up the floor for questions. On behalf of the participants, I want to thank our panelists today for taking time to be here for this important discussion. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they're expected to speak. I have to mention that one of our speakers has not yet joined the webinar, so we're not sure if he's having technical difficulties or not. We'll see how that plays out. Our first speaker, though, who has already joined us, is Johannes Lehmann, who is the Liberty Hyde Bailey Professor of Soil Biogeochemistry and Soil Fertility Management at Cornell University. His specialization is soil organic matter and nutrient studies of managed and natural ecosystems, with a focus on soil carbon sequestration, nutrient recycling from wastes, biochar systems, circular economy, and sustainable agriculture in the tropics, especially in Africa. The speaker we have slated to come up second is Darko Mateovic, who is professor at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, where he teaches in the Mechanical and Materials Engineering Department. His research interests include sustainable energy from biomass and the production and use of biochar as a viable technique for carbon dioxide removal and as a valuable resource material in soil improvement and remediation of contaminated soils. Our third speaker on our list is Kathleen Draper, who's the board chair of the International Biochar Initiative and vice chair of the US Biochar Initiative. Kathleen is the owner of Finger Lakes Biochar, which is focused on biochar activities in New York State, and she is the US director of the Ithaca Institute for Carbon Intelligence, which has a global focus for biochar activities. She's a co-author of Burn, Using Fire to Cool the Earth, as well as Terra Preta, How the World's Most Fertile Soil Can Help Reverse Climate Change and Reduce World Hunger. So first off, we'll have Johannes give his presentation, and we're waiting for Darko to join. If he's unable to join or joins late, we'll jump straight to Kathleen. So for now, let's hear from Johannes. Take it away, Johannes.
Thank you very much, Jason, for the kind introduction and moderating today. And thank you, Alison and Union of Concerned Scientists for putting this together. So I want to share some basic thoughts and then hopefully make some salient points about biochar and the context of carbon dioxide removal, as well as greenhouse gas emission reductions, because that plays a role in that discussion. Just as a preamble, so that we're getting on the right track in framing this, carbon dioxide removal really makes only sense if there's a lot and sincere effort in reducing greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel consumption. I think that's something that probably we all agree in, and that anything that we do, including biochar, is not a silver bullet, but we need a basket of options and that we need to dip into. So that's sort of a wider framing to frame a discussion on biochar as a CDR. My initial motivation, and I believe inspiration for many others in the last 20 years for looking into biochar, is the investigation of the so-called terra preta geosoils. These so-called dark earths in the central Amazon have remarkably high carbon contents and are remarkably fertile. We know that they have been modified by Amerindian populations several thousand years ago, and they are unusually rich in what we now call biochar, this pyrogenic carbon. It is not really clear for all sites, but highly plausible that these biochar amendments were laid down on purpose for something that approximates agriculture, but it is very clear that they were and when, and that they're still there and what effects they have. So those are a remarkable motivation for looking into the persistence of biochar in an environment where carbon cycles much faster than these old C14 dates would belie. Another important framing is that biochar is actually not just peppered somewhere here and there in the environment, but is ubiquitous in our soils, sediments, oceans, and the atmosphere, we have to say. And we're looking at a map here that is still a work in progress in terms of assembling the global data set, and there's much to be done, but it is blatantly clear that biochar is everywhere in soil. So what we're talking about is managing the Earth's carbon cycle and the stocks that are already there, rather than introducing a completely alien substance. So what is biochar? Biochar is the conversion of organic matter, such as here shown for corn cobs, under the exclusion of oxygen, heated to more than 250 degrees, 300 degrees Celsius, at which stage not only water evaporates, but carbon is reconfiguring in so-called amorphous carbon, and then above 500, 600 degrees to an increasing extent in more ordered structures that approximate something like turbostratic carbon. Hydrogen and oxygen is volatilized. Carbon-carbon bonds form that are not usual in biological systems because they are difficult to make and difficult to break. And that's part of the story. The biochar as a product is actually also not new. It has been around for a long time, even in the commercial realm, here from the 30s from the US. But as far as I can see, from the first mentioning in scientific studies and textbooks and farmer outreach materials from the 1850s up to several decades ago, never really bothered in thinking through that there might be different charcoals, what effect they might exactly have, and how we might manipulate and manage it judiciously. So that is really a new way of looking at charcoal or biochar. But I want to make very clear also that biochar is, we shouldn't think about biochar as a material. Biochar is really a system, a pyrolysis or thermochemical conversion system, whereby we need to look at all the moving parts in it. Where's the biomass coming from? What is it? What properties does it have? Yes, what kind of biochar we are producing, but also what kind of gaseous compounds and liquid compounds we might produce. There is a large community, and has always been a large community, that is looking at the oils and condensables, as well as the gases that are produced during pyrolysis. And some of the major chemical companies in the 1800s were actually pyrolysis companies that made all kinds of chemicals from the gases and the liquids. In terms of climate mitigation with biochar, I'd like to distinguish between three broad entry points. One is, of course, when we convert thermochemically biomass, we are generating energy, the gases, the liquids, as well as heat. And those can, under suitable conditions, not always, but under suitable conditions, be transformed into energy that are potentially offsetting fossil fuels. The second one is the one that is probably central to this discussion, is the carbon dioxide removal, but also emission reductions, because we are converting something that mineralizes fast, or relatively fast within weeks and months, into something that mineralizes very, very slowly and does not emit appreciable N2O or CH4 emissions either. And then there's a whole suite here shown on the C of effects that pertain to the ecosystem. When I put biochar into a soil in this context that I'm discussing today, then we can expect changes in greenhouse gas emissions from the soil, so not from the biochar that was added to soil, but from the soil, as well as, for instance, changes in photosynthesis through greater crop growth, and those are fluxes and balances that we need to look at separately from biochar or the fossil fuel emission reductions. So key for this to work is the so-called persistence of biochar, why it has this large longevity. And as I mentioned earlier, this fusing of aromatic structures and the carbon-carbon bonds into clusters that are not all that large, but sufficiently large that they are hard for biological organisms to break down. And that translates into 1 to 2 orders of magnitude lower mineralization in soils than we would otherwise have with the unpyrolized material. And that's the key. It's not there forever, but the mineralization reduces remarkably. And this condensation means there's less hydrogen in there, more organic carbon that is linking to other organic carbon. And this, what's called molecular condensation with increasingly high temperature, relates to higher mean residence times, as shown here for a global data set normalized to same temperatures and across this property of hydrogen to carbon ratios. So it seems that the material property here has a direct relation with a admittedly large scatter, but there is a relationship with the persistence in soil. And that can be utilized to devise predictions, and even as now shown in the latest IPCC guidelines for national greenhouse gas accounting, also a biochar method that in this case translates of the temperature at which biochar is made to a, in this case, these are F perms fractions as they're expressed in IPCC language, of how much there is still after 100 years. So at lower temperature, 65% still there after 100 years, going up to about 90% still there after 100 years if paralyzed above 600 degrees Celsius. So these are opportunities for monitoring practice of conversion rather than only presence after a certain time. So that is an opportunity that is interesting if you're familiar with other CDR technologies to look at. I've so far only looked at the soil itself and the immediate ecosystem, but for a full life cycle assessment, we of course need to consider also where the photosynthesis is happening at the front end, transportation and manufacture of any equipment. So there are even more moving parts than I showed you earlier. These all have to be considered to have any credence in what the emission reductions are, or discount any carbon sequestration and CDR using the total emission balance. And some of the methods are already going into that direction. Some of those can be conservatively neglected because in meta-analysis they have shown to be rather emission reductions and to facilitate accounting that can in some cases be done, but one has to think through that very carefully. A full life cycle assessment would look then something like this, looking at different biomass that can be used here. Crop residues as one broad category where the growth of biomass is incentivized by another factor, in this case food production, or we're producing a dedicated material, or it's only a waste product. And you see that the emission reductions shown here are hovering around 800 for most of these systems, 800 kilograms of CO2e per ton of dry feedstock in. With the exception of when we produce biomass dedicatedly, then we have to consider, make some assumptions about indirect land use change if that is needed. And you can see that that makes, of course, a big difference. What I would also like to highlight here is that this blue part, that's the biochar that is retained in the soil. It makes up a large part of the emission reductions of the system. So obviously, the persistence and the sequestration and the CDR component of the system makes up a large part of the greenhouse gas emission reductions. In this calculation, there is no account of any crop yield increase. And under these assumptions, the emission reductions achieved with biochar additions to soil are roughly equivalent to the emission reductions if that biochar was used for fossil fuel offset in, for instance, a coal-fired power plant. So that means any management and any effects that biochar might have on soil and plants is the effect that tips the balance towards a biochar system having greater emission reductions in addition to carbon sequestration than using biomass for fossil fuel offsets alone. One assumption is, of course, that for fossil fuel offsets to happen at all is that we can use it. In many systems, as you see here, the photo, that's probably not the case. For pine bark beetle kill or forest fire management in California, it's hard to see that always happens. So we need to be not on, well, I might make another point later about farmers, but I would like to highlight that crop yield increases are probably a cornerstone of biochar argument, using it for climate change mitigation and a CDR. And we're getting more confident on a global scale to argue that biochar on average, with large variation, and those are the ones that require site-specific management, on average has an increase in crop yield that is about the same increase that we see with inorganic fertilizer on these same sites to begin with. So we're talking about almost doubling yields compared to fertilizer additions alone. So that's a significant increase. What that means on a global scale, looking at systems, greenhouse gas emission reductions versus soil carbon accrual, or CDR portion of it, and comparing biochar, which has a slightly higher greenhouse gas emission reduction than soil carbon accrual would belie, because there are other moving parts in there, as I explained. Whereas set-asides such as restored wetlands are possibly having, or at the moment, seem to have lower emission reductions than soil carbon accrual alone because of some of the methane kickbacks. And cropland sits somewhere in the middle. So that's something to think about, but they're all sort of in the same order of magnitude. With the last but one slide, I would like to just highlight the fact that bioenergy systems will always produce 100% of the material, or with some losses in there, of course, energy. A BEC system where we inject these emissions into somewhere where they're hopefully not leaking would store 100% of the biomass carbon somewhere. whereas biochar sits sort of in the middle, producing half the energy and storing half the carbon. So having to make an argument for only producing half the energy and half the carbon, we either have to look at the specific situations where this could work, and we've made the point that the additional revenues for increasing crop yields or the readiness, the deployability are arguments, but also there might be a sort of geostrategic discussion to be had where we want to put our arduously photosynthetically fixed carbon, aka plants, whether we want to produce only energy from that, where there might be other options to do that, or we want to retain as much of the organic carbon that's photosynthetically fixed in our terrestrial ecosystems to improve, for instance, soil health. So with that, I'll just repeat take-home messages. There are some synergies between food production and biochar CDR, but there's local optimization needed. There is a higher life cycle emission reductions with biochar than just the CDR portion would belie, and that is important, I think, compared to other opportunities. So when it comes to allocating carbon in our environment, we should think about that. But of course, there are lots of moving parts, and again, there's a local optimization needed. There's no doubt that there's a trade-off between energy and CDR, and we need to think through that, what's worth to us more. And with that, I'll thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Johannes. That was fascinating and quite a bit of information packed in there. And I especially appreciate all the links that you provided to show us the literature sources for a lot of that material. So I'm going to go follow up on those later and check out some of those citations. We haven't yet seen Darko join us, so we're going to go ahead and go straight to Kathleen to hear her presentation. I already see some questions rolling into the Q&A. So those of you who have already submitted questions, you'll be first up. And anyone else who wants to submit a question, feel free to do so. If you're having any other issues or just want to make a comment, you can also use the chat box. Okay, so at this point, I will turn it over to Kathleen. Go ahead. You're still muted at the moment. Just go ahead. There, it looks like you're ready to go.
Okay. Thank you, Jason, Allison, and American University. Whenever I follow Johannes, I like to say, now I'm going to give you the layman version instead of the Lehman version. And a case in point here is how I tend to explain biochar. And you'll see at the back of this slide is a picture of burnt toast. And what I like to say is when you think of pyrolysis, it's basically similar to putting something in the oven, cranking up the temperature. You don't get any real oxygen in there, but if you have it high enough, you can turn it into something that looks like burnt toast. And that is not a very appealing food source, either for humans or for microorganisms. And it also, you can tell, has a lot of nooks and crannies, which they like to inhabitate. And so I think that's a quick and dirty way to think about what biochar is. But I was asked to provide a high-level overview of the current state of the biochar industry, talk about some biochar markets and how to foster market growth, and then to touch on biochar and the carbon removal market landscape. I obviously need a little bit more than 10 or 15 minutes to do that, but I put more information in the slides than I'll have time to cover so that you can go back and look at that at your leisure. Forward this. 1 second. There we go. Okay. So first, let's take a quick look at the biochar industry. And I will say that there is a market difference in the industry in different parts of the world. And the US is certainly not taking a leadership role from a commercial perspective, but that may soon change. A few years ago, it could have been argued that the major constraint to growth was the lack of production technology. Now, however, we're seeing a growing variety of systems at all scales, and that includes backyard kilns, mobile units, modular systems, decentralized mid-scale, industrial scale that are centralized. And there's even a big push, especially in California and the Pacific Northwest, to retrofit existing biomass energy plants to optimize biochar production. So I thought Darko was going to talk about the different types of systems, which includes pyrolysis of many different flavors. We have slow, fast, flash, and even microwave pyrolysis. And gasification can also produce a certain amount of biochar if they're operated right. But I did want to mention that sometimes people confuse incineration with other thermochemical conversion properties, but we do not consider that as one of the technology that produces biochar. So the resulting biochars vary, as Johannes mentioned, in physical, chemical, and biological properties, and can now be found commercially available in most parts of the country. You can see them for sale at Home Depot in 5-gallon buckets, or they're sold in super sacks, or even by the truckload, either as a pure biochar, or more commonly it's blended with compost or other additives. Everyone's always asking about the price of biochar, which I will say varies a lot depending on the quality and several other parameters. One thing to note though is that the price of biochar is falling as production increases, which I believe is a good thing both for the industry and the end users. At the last count, the U.S. Biochar Initiative estimated that there are approximately 150 biochar producers. Most of those are on the small scale, and overall production is still probably below 100,000 tons per year, but it is ramping up. The ecosystem of biochar producers has been evolving from the pure biochar producer model to include those in the biomass energy sector. So that includes not just those producing the energy, but those producing the feedstock for the energy production. Those are in the torrefaction industry. And then we have a variety of players in organics management, including composters, the construction and demolition recycling industry, and more recently, at least in the US, we have wastewater treatment plants that are converting sewage sludge into biochar. And we also have farmers, foresters, and land managers that are beginning to carbonize crop residues. The biochar industry has been changing rapidly a lot in the last few years for many different reasons. I've just covered a bunch of the current strengths within the industry, but we do obviously still have some challenges. So to highlight just a few, I would guess that somewhere north of 90% of the population has still never heard the word biochar. At least that's been my experience. Another challenge we have is that although there are various standards for biochar, including one from the International Biochar Initiative, which covers biochars used in soils and in North America, then there's the European Biochar Certificate Program that has certificates for use in soils, livestock feed, and composites. These standards have not been well adopted. I do see that beginning to change as there's increased interest in biochar as a carbon removal product. And there's also a lack of laboratories that are capable of doing the full suite of characterization to certify biochars. We are still working on that, but it's been a challenge. I would also say there's a need for some unbiased educational materials about biochar for different audiences, including policymakers, biochar manufacturers, and then the various different end users. One of the positive things we've seen since the pandemic, though, is that there are a lot more biochar-related webinars offered by different groups, such as American University and the U.S. Forest Service. The opportunities to scale the industry are growing, especially since we have this increased interest in biochar as a carbon removal market option. As compared with some of the other negative emissions technologies, biochar offers a number of different co-products, as Johannes mentioned. Those include heat, which can be converted into electricity. We have syngas generated with certain technologies, bio-oils, and even wood vinegar. And if those co-products can be monetized, then the price of biochar can be reduced. So biochar has been recognized by the Association of American Plant and Food Control Officials, or APCO, and most biochars can be certified organic by OMRI. There's an exception when it comes to manure biochars, but we're working on getting that updated. And very recently, this year in fact, the USDA, National Resource Conservation Service, has deployed what's called Code 808, or a soil carbon amendment, which is focused on providing funding to farmers to increase soil carbon, specifically using compost, biochar, or a combination of both. And we just heard a week or two ago that at least in New York State, one of 10 states that have adopted it, they would pay farmers up more than $800 per acre for adding biochar. And the price points are different when it comes to blends or compost, but that's a pretty big incentive. One of the more recent and most hopeful opportunities that I've heard about is that there is actually a biochar policy task force on the Biden transition team. So if any of you have any thoughts on what policies could help scale this industry, please let us know. The industry is not without threats, of course. Although most biochars look pretty similar, they are actually very different, as I mentioned before. And this has led to some serious overselling of the benefits of biochar for specific end uses. There's this tendency to claim that a specific biochar can do everything ever claimed in the name of biochar. And we have learned to our detriment that that's just not the case. One concern we hear a lot about is that biochar will kind of follow in the footsteps of ethanol in terms of the food versus fuel dilemma. In this case, it would be food versus feedstock. I would say that until the carbon removal revenue started to be a major factor, I doubted that that scenario would make economic sense. It just didn't pencil out, but it is something I think we need to be wary of now. And I do think it can be controlled by crafting the right carbon methodologies as it relates to sourcing of sustainable feedstock. This is an outdated graphic that I put together about 5 years ago, and I did it to describe the evolution of markets for biochar. It attempted to describe the volume or size of a marketplace, what the price point would be, and what the readiness was. Up at the top left there, I've added some of the more recent categories. We, as an industry, started focusing on the lower left here, mostly as it's used in soils, especially for farmers. But when you think about the early stages of any industry, when the prices are highest and adoption usually comes from the daring few, this might not have been the greatest market to focus on, as farmers are largely conservative and aren't known for having a lot of money to spend on new shiny things, or in this case, black things. I will say, though, that we are starting to see a lot more farmers testing biochar in larger volumes, especially in places that have some significant growing constraints. Think of California with the water challenges, or in many parts of the world, they have toxic soils, and biochar can help immobilize those toxins. This is one of the key areas of focus in China. So biochar producers have started to look for additional markets that are less seasonal and more repeatable, which includes things like filtration, and it also includes livestock feed. This is probably one of the biggest markets over in Europe. And the benefit of adding biochar to feed is that it acts as a carbon delivery system to get the biochar into the soil. And at the same time, it's been found to help improve the health of the animal. In some cases, it's improving the quality and the quantity of the milk produced in dairy animals, and it can help reduce certain greenhouse gas emissions in manures. I will say that the FDA currently does not allow biochar to be included in animal feed in the US, and many people in the industry are looking into this. I'm hopeful that this will be a high priority in the Biden administration. But that said, California recently included it as something that can be included. Those are very specific biochars. They have to be made from a specific kind of feedstock, but it's a great first step. In the US, I would say right now, the largest purchaser of biochar is compost, although there's a big focus right now in putting it in different kinds of building materials. This is something that at the time I originally put this together, it wasn't quite ready, but it is being deployed already in Asia and specifically in Australia, where a company is claiming they put up to 30 tons of biochar per kilometer of road. So that not only creates an excellent carbon sink opportunity, but it does improve certain aspects of asphalt's performance. So most people really are intrigued by the ability of biochar to sequester carbon safely and beneficially. But as we know, not everybody has a comfort level with the discussion on climate change. So there's just so many different ways to talk about biochar. And what this chart is attempting to do is look at it within the context of the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And I don't have enough time to go into all of these, but if climate change is not something that a farmer wants to talk about, which I've found often, you can also talk about it in the context of how it can improve water quality by holding on to nutrients so they don't pollute the local water bodies, or you can talk about it in terms of farmer resilience. The last thing I wanted to talk about was biochar's interaction with the carbon markets, which really, there was a lot of effort put in several years ago to get a methodology accepted on the California exchange, and it all just kind of came to nothing. 2 years ago, when the IPCC highlighted biochar as one of just, a few negative emissions technologies, things really started to change. And last year, for the first time, a voluntary carbon market called Puro, which is based in Finland, selected biochar and 2 other removal products to test in their carbon removal auctions. And the most recent transaction that I've heard about as it relates to biochar on the Puro market is a company in Australia that has a biochar production unit in a greenhouse, and they take waste wood, turn it into biochar, the heat goes into the greenhouse, and the biochar is taken back by the provider of the wood and blended into their compost. And in this situation, they are getting 61 euros per ton of CO2, which in this case, the multiplier is about 2.88. So that converts to roughly $200 per ton of dry biochar. And that's really going to change things. This year, we saw the debut of another voluntary marketplace, which is a blockchain-based market, very focused on biochar, called Carbon Future. They're out of Europe, but they're also looking at US producers. And next year, I know we will be looking at a lot more. Vera is one of the better known marketplaces, and they are very interested in developing a biochar methodology. So that's where I was going to end. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Kathleen. That was fascinating. And we have a bunch of questions rolling in. But thanks for giving us that overview of the market and some of the considerations for how biochar as an industry has evolved and could evolve into the future. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm getting some questions rolling in already. So I would encourage the participants to go ahead and submit your questions through the Q&A tab. And I'll begin kicking a few of them over to our 2 panelists. So first of all, for Johannes, a question comes in that says, please offer a reflection on the changing reception for biochar in this century. For example, over 10 years ago, there were warnings and skepticism in the press, including in The Guardian. How have these been addressed through research since that time? And how has the perception perhaps changed in sort of the public sphere? And then as you might reflect on the changing reception of biochar, could you talk a little bit about how research has helped to accomplish that goal?
Mm-hmm, yeah,
that's a big question, but yeah.
Yeah, well, and now we can start to look back on quite a few years. No, a lot of the questions are good questions that we should always ask, and weigh carefully the answers and look at what needs to be addressed, what kind of research agenda items emanate from such concerns. And I think that that has largely happened within the confines of research funding limitations, as well as, I would say, limitations of implementation and therefore research at scale of implementation. So there are still major agenda items. But one of the big cornerstones, as I pointed out in my brief talk, is that biochar is more persistent than the material you make it from. That is very, that's sort of the alpha and omega of the whole spiel. Because if it doesn't persist longer in soil, then much of, at least half of the emission reductions fall away. And of course, the persistence of any soil improvement and therefore a greater crop growth or other ancillary effects fall away. So that obviously, if you want to prove that a material has a mean residence time of hundreds to thousands of years, you cannot provide this conclusively within a year, right? It's very, you need to wait a little bit until you can actually prove that something decomposes slower than something else. So on day one, you don't know that. Although there are ample natural analogs, but also that takes time to unravel all of that. So the last 10, 15 years, there have been a plethora of studies that looked natural analogs, or how is biochar type carbon cycling in the environment, doing balances for the Earth system, how much biochar type material do we have in global soils, and how much goes in, and calculate mean residence times from that, as well as doing dedicated analysis of adding biochar somewhere and then waiting 5 years or 10 years and then seeing how much is still there. Obviously, you need to wait 10 years until you know how much is there after 10 years. And those things are now possible. That's also the reason why there is now a biochar methodology in the IPCC, National Greenhouse Gas methodology, that nations can now use this IPCC method that was published last year, because we have now a sufficient number of data points to put that. We can always do better, and we don't know it for all possible biochar combinations, but it's enough to get us in the neighborhood and be conservative about assumptions, and still have a viable proposition in terms of the expected permanence over 100 years. So that's certainly, but I would say, as I said just at the beginning of this response, there are not enough farmer implementation and large-scale conversions that we can do all the necessary large-scale systems types analysis that we would like to do. So there are some intermediate steps that need to be done, but they really require engagement by the industry and municipalities and governments to implement those, so that we can see how they work and what the economics are, how the acceptance is. There will be a lot of details to be ironed out.
That was going to be one of my follow-up questions, actually, is what seems to be the bottleneck on the research side. If you could think about, is it not enough labs working on this in a very controlled space? Is it not enough opportunities in sort of an experimental field setting? Or is it like,
well, you're asking a scientist if he wants to have more money for research. I'm saying yes. So that's
but which scientists should have more, exactly. And which types of experiments or studies are sort of the most important right now? Because
yeah, no, that's and Kathleen knows probably even more than I do. But from the science side, I'll just quickly mention from the science side, there's quite a number of labs around the world that are engaging in biochar science and research on the fundamental side as well as some of the applied side. So I would say this is the number of research activity is in biochar is by far outstripping the activity in compost science, for instance, already for many years. So if you take that as a benchmark, so per unit year, we're getting more information about biochar these days than about composting. So that tells you that we're catching up. We know a lot more about compost than we do about biochar, but it's catching up quickly. But indeed, more of the business economics and industrial application side, farmer acceptance and adoption, disadoption side, sort of the scale, the experimentation and the hard research at scale of implementation. That's probably the next big agenda item.
Okay.
I might add to that one of
ahead.
the things we need on the research side is a better understanding of what particular characteristics of biochar are relevant to different end uses. We sort of have more knowledge of that on the soil side, but as biochar is moving into these different end uses, we still don't know what it is that constitutes a good biochar for use in, concrete or filtration to filter specific types of heavy metals or other toxins. So it'd be great to have more research on that.
I wonder, Kathleen, if you could talk a little bit about, just in terms of soil application or soil amendment, it seems that there's quite a bit of variation, and there's also variation in the types of biochar. And I wonder if you could say something about the different factors that affect those outcomes. And you're sort of talking about, as I understand it, kind of matchmaking, right? Like matching up the right biochar with the right conditions. How do we understand how to move forward in that space?
Oh, I defer that definitely to Johannes.
Okay.
He knows much better about that than I do.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot that we need to still know about it. Some of it is blatantly obvious, and it can be tackled with basic agronomy that we keep forgetting when we're discussing this, but that every farmer knows, and so there's a lot that we do know, be it, for instance, lime equivalents. Every farmer knows about pH and whether he or she needs to put lime on or not. So we're getting very close to a recommendation system in that respect. But then there are a lot of others where we know very little. And actually, it's the same with compost or any other amendment. It's also shocking how little we know about fertilizer response, plain nitrogen and phosphorus. Many countries have one fertilizer recommendation for the whole country. So it's not a unique challenge. It's just a new challenge that comes to all the other challenges that we already had. And so we need these recommendations, which type of biochar to add where. The challenge is, of course, that maybe also communication, that when we talk about nitrogen, we know that it's nitrogen. When we talk about biochar, it can be almost anything in the world. So we do need to pay attention that the word biochar implies, gives a certain framework, but within that cloud, there's something that could have a pH of 3 or 12, that could have no nitrogen or a lot of nitrogen. So we do need to cater for all of that. I do have particular interests in some of the esoteric effects on plant and plant micro communication aspects, and I think when we start looking at the rhizosphere ecology of plants, we will, as everybody else who's not also in biochar is discovering that that's so important, that there are specific effects that might still surprise us. So I think there are some properties in terms of conductivities and pores and surface properties that we haven't really had a chance to translate into something that a farmer or a user can actually decipher and translate into something that goes on a label that translates into an adoption. So I think there's quite a bit of discovery still to be done, but what we have in terms of can it replace lime, long-lasting lime, or slow release nitrogen properties and so on, we have enough for moving forward, and products on the marketplace that seem to deliver some of that already. So it's not only in the research domain of a wedge of those projected properties. But they're highly variable, and it's good to look under the hood of all of that. It's still a fast-moving train, so it's good to be vigilant and know something about it.
That's great. I want to circle back to Kathleen again, though. There's a few questions coming in. They touch on the topic of sort of recognition, both in the context of some of these standards. So one question is about, why haven't the gold standard and Vera and at a higher level, the UNFCCC acknowledged biochar as an instrument? And then also there are questions about, what kinds of outreach or kind of public relations, what do we need to get this more widely acknowledged in the public sphere and sort of in a mainstream way, and maybe among some of the potential end users of biochar. Can you tell us a little bit more about either of those two topics?
Yeah, I'll take the second one first. So one of the best impacts of the USDA NRCS adopting this Code 808 that I mentioned, at least in New York State, from what I've heard, what they did is they trained all their agents to learn how biochar is produced, how it should be added to soils and things like that, so that there is this notion of biochar is coming from a respected body of individuals and not just us in the industry saying, you gotta try this. So that alone is worth a lot. And if we could get more organizations like that to trial it and promote it, I think that would be great. Going back to the first question, it's really interesting. I know Johannes has had several conversations with Vera, as have I, and the question has been a little bit hung up on getting funding to get these methodologies developed, but we should actually know by the end of this week if we have some funding to put that in motion. They are very, very interested in getting it developed. And the conversations we've been having are not just let's get it done, but how would that look? Who's going to benefit from that? Is it just the producer? Can it be the person putting the biochar in the ground? So it's a big question, but I think there's a lot of enthusiasm. Just today, in fact, I got notified by a very large oil and gas company that's very interested in biochar as a carbon removal product. So the interest is there. The people that we're putting together a coalition of methodology developers, project developers that will help move this to the next step. But I predict with a high degree of confidence that we'll see something on one of those exchanges next year.
Okay. Assuming that works out, can you talk a little bit about the potential for scaling up? How big could this get? How far could it go? Johannes, if you want to talk about some of your work in the tropics and maybe some of the barriers to deployment in those contexts, that might be helpful, but I'll open this up to both of you.
Kathleen, why don't you start?
Yeah, so the question of scalability is going to be very interesting. Just last night, I was talking to Tom Miles, who's the head of the U.S. Biochar Initiative, and he was talking to the U.S. Forest Service, which is very interested in biochar. They have a 10,000-acre property somewhere in the Midwest, which is also co-hosting a mine that needs to be rehabilitated because there's asbestos there, and the Forestry Service is interested in thinning it so that the fire risk is lowered, and that alone, could constitute a huge carbon sink opportunity because it'll be using waste resources and solving a problem beyond sequestration that needs to be solved economically. So, when you think of those kind of large scale opportunities, and that's just woody biomass, I think it will be easy to scale if we figure this out properly. Can it be abused? Yes. And I think that's where we need to focus the most energy on making sure the feedstock is coming from non-agricultural soils that are converted for that purpose. So yeah, there's challenges, but we have so much unwanted biomass out there, not just woody, but we're now seeing an increased interest in converting sewage sludge. There's a huge plant opening in New Jersey next year that's taking in 440 tons of sewage sludge and converting it into, you know, biochar. It's not a lot, 5 or 10%, but still that's a great use of a resource that causes problems if it's, you know, put on farmland. So yeah, I think we're going to see a big uptick in the next couple of years.
Yeah, any CDR with biomass or soils involving agriculture is by definition a distributed opportunity and a distributed challenge. No, it shares the challenges with thinking about soil carbon sequestration in general. It just has to scale to a petagram number globally. It needs to be happening on many soils, and soil carbon sequestration and biochar would need to be happening in many places. So scaling that up is by definition a challenge. If we think about wind energy or photovoltaics and the 50s and 60s, we might have had optimism in the 60s and 70s that photovoltaic will satisfy our electrical energy needs within years, and certainly the potential. And now we're 50 years later, we're starting to put in the US the first photovoltaics, at least in our area here on our houses. So it took 40, 50 years until from saying, oh, here's the technology, let's get cracking, to, well, is this everything in place, and is the technology there, and do we have the incentive structure, and are people interested, et cetera, et cetera. So will take another 50 years until it has some kind of penetration, so like, starting to get into the double digits, 10% of what it could do. I don't know, but it's our track record in spinning out wind energy and photovoltaics in the US is not great. If it's on the same pathway penetration, then yeah, we'll take another 50 years until we'll see it happening in earnest. But maybe we're also better now. We see the urgency, and I would say it's an avenue that could have also a back-end incentive that farmers, and that is where I think we have to put the focus on the farmer, not just on the front end biomass. No farmer or land use manager will put that in the soil if it doesn't support what that farmer does every day. That farmer is a chicken farmer or a dairy farmer or a corn farmer. It needs to improve corn growing or some of the core enterprise of that farmer. And if it doesn't do that corn farmer is probably not gonna be a methane farmer or a carbon farmer only. That farmer is still a poultry or dairy or a corn farmer. But this end stage incentive, the back end incentive, if that's happening, that can create a pull also that maybe some of the photovoltaics didn't have. But on the other hand, having a lot of moving parts and a lot of winds that in theory are beautiful if they all come together, also means that maybe they have to come together to create a socially and an economically viable package. And if you have lots of moving parts, it's getting notoriously more difficult to optimize at a given location, but you also have more options to optimize. So it's really a balance. I think we'll have to take it one step at a time and move this forward where the benefits, especially the front and the end benefits, are blatantly obvious when we're taking care of an environmental issue on the front end, and we're creating value in the soil or somewhere else at the back end. And if that comes together at its location X, then we should start there. And that will keep us busy for the next decade, I'm sure, only to take care of those.
I just wanted to say that in China, the estimates for biochar production are probably 5 times what they are in the US. Though it's a little hard to verify that number, but they're really ambitious about it. And they just published a paper recently in China where they estimated that if they went full scale, they could probably sequester the equivalent of 15% of their greenhouse gas emissions in China. And some people think that might be a conservative number because it didn't take into account you know, reduction in methane or nitrous oxide. So that's not a bad
That would
number.
be a huge deal for the world's largest emitting country at this point. So that's quite amazing, and that's a significant scale on the order of what the entire terrestrial sink provides to the U.S. in relative to its scale of emissions. So that would be an enormous thing. We are approaching time, or actually a little bit past it, and we still have lots of questions rolling in. So I hope that those will be captured by our hosts, and they'll be available for people to refer to in the future. And I encourage people participating in this webinar to follow up and see if we can learn more from our two speakers and through the Institute itself, which I expect will be providing more information on this topic. And especially as those new findings roll out that you described, Johannes, over the next decade. Hopefully we'll have the chance to check in sooner than that to see how things are going. I also want to mention that, you know, a number of people who submitted questions were expressing some concerns about the potential for this to sort of create perverse outcomes. And I know that that's on everyone's mind with all of these CDR technologies. So that's something to keep in mind. It sounds like the two of you are optimistic that we can do this in a safe way that provides some real benefits without going down those perverse paths. And so I think we'll all be keeping an eye on that and hoping that that's the case and doing what we can. It also sounds like there's possibly an opportunity for this to move forward in a more accelerated way because of the interest that's been expressed by the Biden transition team. So we'll see where that ends up as well. With that, unless there's anything else that comes through from our hosts, I think I'll go ahead and wrap things up here. Thank you to everyone for your interest and participation. Thank you to our two speakers, Kathleen and Johannes, for sharing your insights and wisdom. And look forward to hearing more from the Institute about other topics related to carbon dioxide removal. So thanks everyone, and
thank you very much.
See you next time.